Good afternoon. We'll see if anybody else winds up joining us. Hello, ladies. Appropriately, the fourth of the four rabbis that I wanted to talk to you about is my friend Sally Rizan, and especially to mark this weekend's anniversary. No, actually, it's the following weekend. It was the weekend after Memorial Day weekend. In 1972, I was actually there, and I remember it quite vividly at the Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati, Ohio, when Sally was ordained as the first woman in the modern era, certainly in North America, to be ordained as a woman. It was memorable not only because at the moment, and we'll share this a little bit later in her own memories, because spontaneously, when she came up onto the bima of Plum Street Temple to be ordained by Alfred Gottschalk, the entire congregation, her classmates at the forefront, but the entire congregation rose to recognize the importance of the particular moment. I not only remember that moment from the service on June 3rd, 1972, but it was also the second time that I was in a group of 4 or 5 12-string guitar players. That we had, there was some new music that had been composed specifically. Several months earlier was the inauguration ceremony for Dr. Gottschalk as the Rosh Yeshiva, as the president of the Hebrew Union College. Again, more about that in a few moments. But Cantor William Charlin from Los Angeles, who was a personal friend of Gottschalk's, had composed some new arrangements of liturgical pieces for that ceremony, and he included a number of pieces that we played with 12-string guitars, and the sound of the 5 or 6 12-string guitars in that 100-year-old sanctuary back in Cincinnati was an amazing sound. So it was memorable that we did it again 3 months later at Sally's ordination at that service, and I still hear that sound resonating in my mind. Okay, so and incidentally, through this whole series of the 4 Meet the Rabbis, I tried to show you a little bit, if I had a personal connection with the 4. Sally and I, obviously, she was just finishing rabbinical school when I first began, but being both of us from Cleveland, our paths had crossed a number of times, and even just 3 weeks ago, I received a happy birthday message from her. So Sally and I still keep in touch, although she obviously has friends and colleagues all around the world. Okay, so Sally was born and was originally raised as a young girl in Cleveland Heights, which was the same suburb in which, again, not that I was born, but that I was raised. I belonged to a Reformed congregation, belonged to a conservative congregation, Betham, which was somewhat of a liberal Reformed congregation, but a small congregation in the Cleveland area. Later on, she had moved then to the west side of Cleveland. That's on the east side. She moved to the west side of Cleveland, where there was really only one synagogue for that entire area of the city, and it was a Reformed congregation. Did not have a rabbi. They were only served by a number of student rabbis who would drive up from the Cincinnati Rabbinic School every other weekend. We used to call it a bi-weekly student pulpit. So there were quite a number of student rabbis that came through the synagogue in the Beth Israel on the west side of Cleveland. And because of the influence of the younger rabbis, rather than the older, more veteran and set in their ways rabbis from the east side of the city, here in the Reform congregation on the west side of Cleveland, Sally, when she was growing up, saw women reading from the Torah. She saw women who were elected to the lay leadership, the board of trustees, and served as chairpersons of committees, et cetera, et cetera. And for the first time, she saw women being involved in the synagogue proper. She also attended what was then called Union Camp Institute, UCI, which was the first, that time was the first of the summer camps that was sponsored by the Reform movement in Zionsville, Indiana, part of the west suburbs of Indianapolis. She was very much strengthened by her involvement and the role modeling then of there weren't any women, but the role modeling of all these younger rabbinic students at the time. She came back and she worked out a deal with the student rabbi or rabbis while she was in high school. She worked out a deal where they allowed her to learn how to read, help lead services, give a little sermonette every once in a while. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Give a little sermonette every once in a while, and write what is the bone of every rabbi's existence, and that's writing an article for the Temple Bulletin every month. So, and those who have been president of the synagogue can nod their head and it's something, right? We do that frequently. So so that was her growing up experience. In the late 1960s, or through the late 1960s, ending officially in about 1972 or 73, the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the Reform Rabbinic School in Cincinnati, had an official program with the University of Cincinnati. They also had it in New York City with NYU, where instead of normally taking 4 years for an undergraduate degree and 5 years for rabbinic school, you could apply jointly to University of Cincinnati and Hebrew Union College and complete the 9-year program. You could complete it in 8 years with your undergraduate program, a BA from University of Cincinnati. And during those 4 years, with all of your electives, you would take classes at the rabbinic school. So you could save a year. So that's a program that Sally did. Also, a program that one of my closest friends, Bennett Miller from New Jersey, he did that program also and finished in 8 years rather than the normal 9 years. During the time that she was at rabbinic school, then her student pulpit, as opposed to driving up to Cleveland or going to Gadsden, Alabama, or Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is where I went on a regular basis to serve the small communities. Sally's student pulpit was right in Cincinnati, as at the Isaac Mayer Wise Temple, which of course was the sanctuary on Plum Street, where she would eventually be ordained. During that time, she encountered a lot of pushback from faculty, from members of the congregation, but she still persisted with the support and the encouragement of then the man who was the president, the far-visioned president of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, a scholar by the name of Dr. Nelson Glick. So just a word about Nelson Glick. He was a world famous archaeologist, especially during World War I and early World War II. He was a friend of the famous Lawrence of Arabia, did a lot of research in then was known as Palestine, and in many in the Sinai Peninsula, southern Egypt. He was a biblical scholar. He had trained and has his PhD from one of the German universities. I forget exactly which one, but Glick had become a rabbi, as well as a biblical scholar, as well as an archaeologist, as well as secretly working for the forerunners of the CIA, working for the U.S. government secretly, and helping to map out areas where if the U.S. Army or the Allies would have to go into the desert, he was able to show them the maps of the best way to go in the wadis and the valleys between the mountains, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nelson Glick, I said far vision and for vision, not only because he was the one who insisted that, yes, there should be a woman ordained as a rabbi, and that would lead into many, many, many more in the future. And it was one of his lifelong dreams that there would be women ordained as rabbis, which of course has become the case now over the last 50 years. But Glick also being so committed to the state of Israel, he was the one who insisted that beginning in the academic year of 1970 to 71, that all rabbinic students, at least from the Reform movement, and that was followed then by the Reconstructionist and the Conservative, that all of us had to spend our first year studying in Jerusalem. It was his dream. It took 3 years to implement the dream, with the support of someone whose name you might know, Golda Meir. Golda helped push it through the Israeli government and authorized the building of a building right in Jerusalem, right almost next door to the King David Hotel. They have like a 100-year lease on that property for $1 a year, thanks to Golda's involvement. And Nelson Glick saw that requirement instituted, not only that dream, and I was a part of that class. And about 2 months after we arrived in Israel, Golda was brought to the campus and spoke to all of us about how she shared the dream that American students, American Reform rabbis would be able to study in Israel and be comfortable with Hebrew as a modern language, and all that. Unfortunately, only about 3 months after that, there's a very famous picture of Golda and Dr. Glick standing in one of the classrooms in the building. Only about 3 months later, Dr. Glick sadly passed away, and so he lived to see the dream of us as students being in Jerusalem. He did not live to see the dream of Sally being ordained as the first woman rabbi. But as you will hear a little bit later, but his wife, his widow, was present, and she spoke at the service in which Sally was ordained, as well as because we were recipients of his dream and vision. So she also spoke at our ordination in 1975, so that we have that connection as well. Alfred Gottschalk, who had been the dean of the Hebrew Union College campus in Los Angeles, was confirmed as the new president of the college, and so he began functioning as the rabbi who would ordain the graduates. Ordination in Hebrew is known as smicha, which comes from the Hebrew word that means to place your hands on another's head, whatever, and bless, which is the way that we were all blessed, our class, then also by Rabbi Gottschalk instead of Dr. Glick. Okay, so there's that. I think that there's that background, if you will. So Sally tells the story that when she was living in Cincinnati and was studying to be the first rabbi, as the word started, the first woman rabbi, as the word started to get out in her neighborhood, her mailman, who happened to be Black, the mailman knocked on her door one day as he was delivering a package, and he said, "This is addressed to Rabbi Sally Priesand." I didn't know that, what, so he wanted the whole story. So she told him the story. And according to her, who she wrote it down, this is what he said: "I think it would be more difficult for me to be the president of the KKK than for you to be a rabbi." So that was, even the non-Jewish world, even the Black community recognized how much of a struggle she was going to be encountering. When she was ordained, like I said, in 1972, June of 1972, to no one's surprise, the very, very experimental, innovative congregation that's not too far, it's only a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now, the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. Then it was on West 48th Street in Manhattan. The Stephen Wise Free Synagogue employed and brought Sally there as their assistant rabbi. She stayed for like 9 years as assistant rabbi, then as associate rabbi. Then she worked 2 years as a hospital chaplain and getting her accreditation. We call it a CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. And then that was followed by 25 years as the senior rabbi of Monmouth Reform Temple in Monmouth, New Jersey. So she was the first, June 3rd of 1972. And since then, as of last week, which was another ordination ceremony, as of last week, more than 850 women have been ordained as rabbis by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and another 700 plus have been ordained around the world, including now with some caveats and disclaimers. We can talk about that a little bit later, even by the Orthodox. So now all of the major streams of Judaism around the world do ordain in one way or another, do ordain women. And Sally was the first. She never married intentionally, she said. Maybe it's also because the right person, the right partner never came along. But she said intentionally, never married. Quote, "It would be too hard to balance being that first woman rabbi and giving my family the proper attention that they would deserve." Okay. Now, there's a little bit of biography. I want to share some of her own thoughts. So bear with me as these are going to be extended quotes that from some of the things that she has written and things that were written about her as well. She wrote a foreword to one of the new books that the Central Conference of American Rabbis, that's the Reform movement in North America, one of the new books that was just being published, called "This Joyous Soul: A New Voice for Ancient Yearnings in Judaism." And this is her introduction. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, also known as the Kotzker Rebbe, is remembered for his profoundly wise sayings. often simple and always insightful. When asked where God is, he answered that God dwells wherever people let God in. Prayer is one of the ways in which we let God in, offering us the opportunity to open our hearts to God's presence. Thus, prayer books exist to help us communicate with God. Prayer books enable us to look within, to those values that shape our lives. They assist us in gathering strength and courage for the tasks that remain undone. In many ways, a prayer book is a history book that reflects the story of those who created and those who pray from it. Each generation adds its own piece to the puzzle, that is Judaism. A prayer book reflects those beliefs that are important to its users and provides insight into how Jewish tradition evolves from generation to generation. Our children and grandchildren would probably find it strange to pray from a Siddur, a prayer book, that did not mention the matriarchs, that talked about Israel only with the wish that the sacrificial cult would be restored, that consistently referred to God as He. They are the product of their generation, and their response to a prayer book reflects the values with which they have grown up. A willingness to change makes possible the continuity of our Jewish tradition. So that's the framework in which Sally has always lived her life, explored and taught within her rabbinate, and with a great deal of humility, but also with a great deal of confidence, how she has approached being the first woman rabbi. Let me continue with her own words. As I reflect on the past 50 years, I'm grateful to God that part of my life's work has been to open new doors for women in the Jewish community. But at the same time, I have tried never to lose sight of the larger mission of the Jewish people, which is to derive from the words of Torah a set of values and a sense of holiness that will enable us always to be partners with God in completing the world. Dr. Nelson Glick, who was the president of HUC JIR, was the man most responsible for my ordination. He was passionate about those things that were important to him, and he had a certain charm that inspired others to dream bigger and to do more. Someone once said, he brushed away the ruts that others were prone to stumble in. He stepped right over them. He didn't even see them. He had a higher horizon. She continues, that horizon enabled him to envision a day when women would serve the Jewish people as rabbis. So from the moment I arrived in Cincinnati, I knew that he believed in me. And I was conscious of the fact that ordaining a woman as a rabbi was a decision being made by the College Institute itself under his leadership. I was devastated when Dr. Glick died a year and a half before my ordination. But his wife, Helen, a distinguished physician and researcher in Cincinnati, told me that before he died, he said there were 3 things he wanted to live to do, and one of them was to ordain me. Throughout my career, I have had a picture of Dr. Glick hanging above my desk, together with a letter from his wife, dated March 19, 1971. The letter ends this way. I have already told you how meaningful your ordination would have been for him and how he would have loved to have seen that day. I'm sure when I see you ordained next year, in my mind's eye, I will see his hands on your shoulders, for no matter whose hands are there, the meaning will be clear, the continuity of Jewish life and his immortality of spirit. Was a very, very strong, he was tall, he was about 6'4". He was a giant of a man in more ways than one. Sally continues, I came to HUC-JAR because I wanted to be a congregational rabbi. That dream was fulfilled for me in 1981 when I became the rabbi of Monmouth Reform Temple, a position I was privileged to hold for 25 years, becoming Rabbi Emerita upon my retirement. Its members were warm and welcoming, open to new ideas, and unafraid of new challenges. They allowed me to be myself, to experiment and be creative, and they were willing to take responsibility for their own Jewishness, one mitzvah at a time. Together, we created a temple family. We studied Torah, hoping to discover what God would have us do and have us be. Our commitment to social justice grew from year to year. We provided a Jewish presence in our community, joining with others in the task of Tikkun Olam. Without my temple family, my life would never be the same. They kept me grounded and treated me not as the first, but simply as their rabbi. My experience tells me that we are richer for the gifts that female rabbis bring to our shared task. Rethinking previous models of leadership, empowering others to become more responsible for their own Jewishness, discovering new models of divinity, knowing that God embodies characteristics both masculine and feminine, training new leaders to be more gender aware, welcoming to our institutions of higher learning respected female scholars able to share with us lessons and insights that are unique to women, creating new role models and allowing to be heard, often for the first time, the stories of those whose voices have been silenced for too long, the countless number of women who have enriched our people from biblical times until now. I want to thank my 35 classmates in Cincinnati for always making me feel like part of the class. And we would add, those of us who remember those days, it wasn't that way. It wasn't the same with all the faculty. There were faculty for the first several years who definitely did not give a welcoming tone to the women students. To them, she says, I have never forgotten that day of our ordination when I was called to the bima, and you very spontaneously stood up to honor this important moment in Jewish history. I think of that often and shall always be grateful for your kindness and friendship. So that's that. Hang on 1 second. Somebody's sending me a message. I want to make sure it's not urgent. Okay. She was asked in an interview, what do you hope your legacy to be? And I'll give you that quote. I want my legacy to remind people that any person can do or be whatever she or he wants to, and that you shouldn't put your dreams aside, even if they seem impossible. Okay, so that's an introduction to Rabbi Sally Priesand. I also want to give you just a little bit of a postscript, and then some other comments, and then of course questions. Actually, pardon me. Actually, while there are women who play a prominent role, yes, in the Bible, we think of Miriam and we think of Deborah and Yael and several others. So going back to the matriarchs whom we mentioned, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And in the rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, there are certainly women who play important roles in the stories and the debates and in the teaching lessons and insights of the rabbinic literature, whether they are named or whether just identified as some rabbi's wife or some a particular rabbi's daughter, but they are included. But to the best of our knowledge, the title of rabbi was not applied to a woman until the 1930s. Because actually there was a woman rabbi. We have to work on our German here rather than just English. There was a woman rabbi by the name of Regina Jonas, who was given the title of der Rabbiner. Now, some might say, well, that's not really the exact translation of rabbi, but you have to know some of the nuances of higher German, higher Deutsch, to understand the little distinctions in German language. But Regina Jonas had been a student in a very famous Jewish academy in Berlin, known, again, here I have to work on my German, I haven't done it in quite a few years, in the Hochschule für das Wissenschaft des Judentums, okay? The Higher Institute for the Scientific Study of Judaism. That was the name of the secondary school. It was more of a high school than it was actually a college or a university. And Regina Jonas was one of the students there. She had been admitted by a particular rabbi whose name was Edward Benneth. I don't think it's related to our Mike Benish, but Benneth, B-A-N-E-T-H, Rabbi Edward Benneth, who had fought against the faculty and the administration, and as dean of the school, had admitted her with the understanding that if she could academically participate in what was then, I'm almost positive it was a 6-year secondary school program, and then it led into a baccalaureate degree and also rabbinic ordination. This is from the real liberal community. They didn't use the word reform then. It was liberal or progressive. Rabbi Banneth was the one who had fought for Regina Jonas to be admitted into the program. Unfortunately, he died before she could complete all of the 6-7 years, whatever it was. And which is, sadly, there's a parallel to Nelson Glick in Cincinnati, who had envisioned being able to ordain Sally Priesand as the first woman rabbi. The difference was that Alfred Gottschalk, who succeeded Glick, was very much in favor of ordaining a woman rabbi, whereas the new what's called the Rosh Yeshiva, I don't know how to say that in German, but the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the seminary, the yeshiva part of the Hochschule program back in Berlin, the man who succeeded Rabbi Banneth was a rabbi by the name of Hauch Albeck. And most rabbinic students are familiar with Albeck's work because he has one of the major dictionaries that translated biblical Hebrew and rabbinic Talmudic Hebrew into modern Hebrew. So people refer quite frequently to the Albeck dictionary, and also he had a commentary on the Mishnah. And people, one of the more modern commentaries on the Mishnah, that usually is studied in Israeli secondary school curricula, like in 10th and 11th grade. They use the Albeck commentary to study Mishnah. Anyway, Albeck, who succeeded Banneth as the Rosh Yeshiva, as the head of the seminary program in Berlin, he was not in favor of ordaining women as rabbis. So Regina Jonas not able to be ordained within that program. One individual rabbi, not from the faculty of the Hochschule, but one individual rabbi by the name of Max Dienemann, who was the president of the Liberal Rabbis Conference or Association. Again, don't worry about all these German terms. It would take me 5 minutes just to have to give all these long terms. But Rabbi Max Dienemann, who was the president of the congregationally affiliated liberal rabbis, led a ceremony and gave Regina Jonas a certificate of smicha. Again, smicha or ordination is the laying upon of hands on your head or on your shoulders. And Regina, her thesis for the program actually was, can a woman be a rabbi? And the suggestion that came out of her thesis and doing all the research was that while we can't really use the term, and this of course is all in German, but while we can't really use the term rabbi for a woman, and I'll comment, or we'll talk about that in a few minutes, we can't really use the formal term rabbi or rav in Hebrew. We can say that this individual, this student, this teacher, this counselor, whatever, has the heart of a rabbi, which is why they came up with a der Rabbiner German phrase, more like I guess a better translation would be rabbi-like, rabbi-like. Today we would probably say para-rabbi, although it's that's a different kind of training, and they actually do have that kind of a program for para-rabbis or para-rabbinic people like that. So der Rabbiner Regina Jonas, for 7 years served as a hospital chaplain and a chaplain in retirement homes. And then she and her mother, that takes us into 1942. And now, of course, the Nazis are in charge. Regina and her mother were deported to Terezin or Theresienstadt, if you know the story of Theresienstadt, which was the model concentration camp that was run almost like a summer camp. It was the model concentration camp that the Red Cross or other dignitaries were brought to when there were complaints about how the Nazis were treating their Jews or other political prisoners. And if you visited Terezin or Theresienstadt, it's about 2 hours north of Prague. There's museums there. Again, it kind of looks like it was more of a camp or a camp's environment rather than a concentration camp. We talked about Leo Beck back in April. That's where Leo Beck also served the community and welcomed Regina Jonas to work with him in teaching and serving the community there in Theresienstadt. Apparently also Regina Jonas interacted with Viktor Frankl, who's a psychoanalyst that some of you may be familiar with Frankl's work also. Also he was in Theresienstadt. Both Leo Beck and Viktor Frankl survived the camps. Regina Jonas did not. We do have records that she taught a number of classes and assisted Leo Beck in running the Shabbat and holiday services. She taught classes like Women in the Bible, Women in the Talmud. Her mother died there in Theresienstadt, but she was sent to Auschwitz. And while we don't have an exact date, the assumption is that she died within a few days of arriving in Auschwitz, which was October of 1944. Um, many of the women rabbis, especially, I don't think it was Rabbi Sally Priesand's idea. I think it was the idea of Rabbi Ellen Weinberg, Weinberg Dreyfus, Ellen Weinberg Dreyfus, and of Rabbi Denise Iger, who were two of the more recent women presidents of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. I mentioned Ellen again, talking about Leo Beck, because her husband is Beck's grandson. But they proposed that there be a minhag, a custom of acknowledging a yard site for Regina Jonas as the first day of the Hebrew month of Cheshvan in the fall. The month of Cheshvan is sometimes known as the month of bitterness because there are no holidays in that month at all. So it's called a bitter month. And they felt that even without knowing exactly the day of her death, but it most likely was near the beginning of the month of Cheshvan in 1944. So there was a whole seminar about it, and quite a few years ago they proposed having Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month of Cheshvan, be the official yard site and memorial. And there have been study sessions devoted to Regina Jonas. And again, my friend Denise Iger from Los Angeles, she wrote this was her quote: "We mourn her death bitterly, and we celebrate her historic life and her dedication as apparently," we have to put the word apparently there, as the first woman rabbi. So Sally Priesand, yes, 50 years ago next week. Regina Jonas back in the 1930s and 40s as Der Rabbiner. They were the first of the women rabbis that obviously now represent, apparently, I don't know the exact statistic, but I heard recently that more than half of the rabbis, and certainly I think as much as 2/3 of the cantors who are serving Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative synagogues, not only in North America, but around the world, more than half of the rabbis who are serving congregations are women. And all going back to the days of Sally Priesand, or before her, back to Regina Jonas. So one more overriding comment, if you will. Why is it such a problem? Why, throughout thousands of years of Jewish history, 2,000 years officially of the institution of the rabbinate, rather than just Rav as an honorific, as a title of or an honorary title of someone who was a teacher, a scholar, someone who was worthy of respect and being singled out in the community, started 2,000 years ago. But why is it that only within the last 80 years or whatever that we've had women? Well, the problem for the most part focuses on two realities in Jewish law. The first is that, and not first and second in importance, because most likely the second one is really more important. But the traditional words, I mentioned the ceremony known as smicha, or ordination, of the placing of hands and giving a particular blessing and carrying on, transmitting the authority, which traditionally, legendarily, is there such a word? Legendarily, goes back to Moses. In the words of the Pirkei Avot, of the Ethics of the Fathers, which appear in the Mishnah at the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, we have this line of tradition. Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai, and Moses gave it to Joshua. And Joshua gave it to the elders of the people. And the elders of the people gave it to the leaders of the 12 tribes. And then they in turn gave it to the members of the Sanhedrin. And then the Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, those who led the worship in the different communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And supposedly, like I say, legendarily, this transmission of Torah, of Jewish authority, goes all the way back to Moses. And when in the ceremony, at least as far back as we can trace it, the ceremony as well as the document, the ordination document, includes not only the name of the individual, not only the time and place, like a typical legal document would have, but the statement is Yore Yadin Yadin. May he teach, may he judge, serve as a judge. And each verb is there twice. Yore and Yadin Yadin. Because those were the traditional two roles of the rabbi. Forget this about conducting, standing up, conducting services. Forget about conducting weddings or funerals or brises or bar mitzvahs or whatever. That's not the origin of the rabbi. The rabbi was the teacher of Torah, and the judge, the arbiter, when there was or arbitrator when there was an argument. And since that was the phrase that was used and that was conferred as, call it the job description, if you will. Here's the problem. A woman can serve as a teacher because teaching is not necessarily time-bound. You can teach anytime. But to serve as a judge in the context of Jewish tradition and Jewish community, women were precluded, not prohibited, but precluded from serving as judges. And that leads into the second reason, which is really the most overriding reason, not only of why women can't or traditionally weren't serving as rabbis, but why they also weren't serving as judges or leaders of the community or decisors or ones who would make the ultimate decisions on behalf of, whether it's just a family or whether it's a tribe or whether it's a community or a city or a country or whatever. Jewish law, and here's where we have to make a distinction between Jewish law and Jewish custom, or as Tevi would say, tradition. Why do we do it? Tradition. I don't know why we do it, but it's tradition. Okay. So Jewish law says women are precluded from, women are not obligated to participate in those mitzvot, those commandments, the mitzvot, the practices, if you will, the deeds or the restrictions. Women are not obligated to participate in those that are specifically time bound. Shazman Goram is the Hebrew phrase, or the Aramaic phrase in the Talmud. Women are exempt. Now, in the olden days, exempt, as I suppose the word really should mean, means you're not obligated to. You can choose to, but you're not obligated. It's not mandatory for you. Why was it not mandatory? Why was it not obligatory for a woman to do those particular mitzvot that were time bound? Well, we can cite two reasons at least. One is that the community didn't want to put women, mothers especially, into the difficult situation of conflict of interest. I have an obligation to serve as a judge, to appear in a court or whatever it might be. Like I said, leave conducting services and whatever, leave all that out. But I've been invited. The woman says, I've been invited to serve as a judge or to bring testimony or something in such and such a case at such and such a time. But my baby is crying or my baby is sick. And there's a real conflict of interest, because we believe that the role of a woman, of course, is to be a nurturer and be supportive of and a provider for her children. So one thought is that the rabbis, the sages, we refer to them as Chazal, as the Chachamei, the wise ones of our tradition, said, let's not put women into that situation, into where they're obligated. If they're available to serve as a judge, fine. If they're available to go out at night and be the one person who looks up into the sky, here's a plug for the June 1st program with David Levy, right? If the woman is available to go out and be the one to determine, there's the new moon, or if the woman is available to be the one to sound the shofar, or if the woman is available to be the one to do whatever it is, or whatever it was in the mitzvot that had to be done at a certain time. If she's available, fine. But we don't want her to feel guilty if she's not available. Her raising her child, responding to the need of her own child or children, is more important than any other function. So that was one reason in the olden days, as the sages said, that women were exempt from serving as judges, were exempt from serving as leaders of the community, whatever, so that they didn't have that conflict of interest. The second overriding problem area was that because one of the long-standing prohibitions or taboos in Jewish tradition was that anything that would be touch or be put into contact with a flow of blood rendered it impure, rendered it what they call tahor, tahor and tameh. Tameh is ritually impure. Okay? So a woman on a regular basis has a menstrual flow. There's blood, could be blood on her fingers, on her hand, and anywhere. And again, and rather than having to put women into the uncomfortable position of saying, oh, well, thank you for inviting me to read the Torah or whatever, but I'm having my period today, or I'm having my period this week, and I can't do it. So rather than using that kind of an example, I could give others, but rather than putting women into the situation where they might unintentionally be touching something that was holy, the Torah or something else, some document, rather than putting her in the situation where she might unintentionally make that, the Torah scroll, let's use that as the example, make it impure. They just said women are not prohibited, but women don't have to, or don't have the obligation. Okay? You can't go, if you need a minyan, you need the religious quorum for a service or for such and such to take place. Don't put the woman in the position of saying, oh, well, we have 9, will you be the 10th, where she has to say, I'm sorry, I can't because I'm having my period. That might be uncomfortable, it might be embarrassing. So they just made the blanket statement, we're not going to count the women. Or women shouldn't be put in the position of being standing up at the Torah, ready to read the Torah in front of the whole congregation, and all of a sudden realize that she's started her flow and have to back off. So whether it's right or whether it's wrong, they made that general principle that those mitzvot or those practices that might be time bound or that were involved, that revolved around ritual items that could be sacred items that could be defiled, made impure if she had her menstrual flow, or if there were any other. Now, men can have, blood, flowing of blood or some other kind of fluid also. But, again, in those days, they didn't worry about the men so much as they worried about the women. But those were the two overriding reasons, whether they're right or not, whether they were taken, way too far to the nth degree that it shouldn't have been that much, but they were for centuries. It went from the law, which we can understand whether we agree with it or not, but we can understand where the law came from. But what we can certainly criticize is the way tradition over the centuries of how it went from women were not obligated to, it went from that into women are prohibited from. Women may not do the following. What now in the 20th century, thanks to not just the Regina Jonases and the Sally Priesans and all the other women's and the Susanna Heschels and all the other women scholars of our era, but thanks also to those male scholars who believed that it was time for this to be somehow responded to, can I say remedied, that under the circumstances today, with what we understand about psychology, what we understand about roles of male and female, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the protections that we can take, there are some Orthodox congregations now that have 2 Torah scrolls, one that will only be touched by women and one that will only be touched by men. So they don't have to be concerned about someone who's going to say, oy vey, chas v'chalila, that the woman might be having her period and she touched our scroll, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to a certain extent, I wanted to add some of those comments also, but to a certain extent, yes, we can give great credence and great admiration to the work that was begun publicly through Regina Jonas and Sally Priesand. But I think we also have to give a great deal of thanks to those scholars, male and female, in the Jewish world, and certainly not just in the Reform community, who have done the research. We celebrated also back in, I think it was back in March, we acknowledged that Judith Kaplan Eisenstadt, who was the first bat mitzvah, who said to her family, who was a teacher, the rabbi and faculty member at the Jewish Theological Seminary, 1927. And she said to him, show me where in the text it says women cannot become bat mitzvah. a scholar couldn't find it and whatever. And that led to the development not only of bat mitzvah as a practice now, which is totally accepted in the around the world in the Jewish community, in one way or another. But it also led to a new understanding of what bar mitzvah would mean for Jewish young men. So all of this, and with this, I'm kind of concluding the whole series to say that the four rabbis that we talked about, going back to Rabbi Papo and Rabbi Freyhoff and Rabbi Beck, and now Rabbi Presand, and those who have been inspired by them and those who have followed in their footsteps, really have brought us to the kind of vital, vibrant, and relevant, liberal Jewish community to which we all belong. So I will step back, have a sip of my iced coffee, and see if anybody has questions. Mike, I know, had to leave, but if any of the rest of you do have questions or want to continue with the conversation for a couple minutes. Everybody's muted, but oh, that's okay.
Rabbi, I think I kind of wonder how much of this, I mean, I understand what you said and everything, but coming from the woman's perspective, I wonder how much of this was because up until very, very, very recently, Dad didn't want to touch a dirty diaper.
Right.
And, and God forbid, I mean, it was woman's work and, and
Right.
all this stuff. And how much of it also in the Orthodox community was that they weren't allowed to listen to a woman's voice in song and everything is chanted.
Sure.
I mean, I remember when my daughter was in Orthodox day school, they had secular studies in the morning and Judaic in the afternoon, and the boys and the girls had secular together, but they went their separate directions.
That's right.
They did not have
right.
classes together because the girls were not allowed to learn Mishnah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that wasn't that long ago.
No, in the early 1960s, 1959, 1960, 61, when I went to Orthodox summer camp, the boy, even in the summer camp time,
Mm-hmm.
the boys we had an early morning chakra service before breakfast. The girls didn't come. The boys went, and then we didn't see the girls until breakfast time.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have to come to services.
I mean, that's even when my daughter was at school in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was that was the way it was. So,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
It's just a change in the times, period.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's the changing of time, and society's
Mm-hmm.
changing of time. But we'd like to think that it's for the better. But with the overlay of all the cultural, that wasn't just Jewish men who
Right. Yeah.
wouldn't do a dirty diaper. That there's all that cultural overlay.
Exactly.
But the realization that some of the, like I said, the tradition kind of has led us in a different path from perhaps, and I won't say it's only perhaps, from perhaps what the intention of the original halacha might have been.
Yeah.
Okay. I had no idea that, the history of the woman being considered, rabbinic or rabbi went back to 1927. Did you say?
The 27 was the first bat mitzvah.
The first bat mitzvah.
Bat for a 13-year-old, 12, 13-year-old. Actually, she was 12.
Well, that kind of opened the door for, women.
Exactly. And
You
then
know.
Regina Jonas in 1935. Sally in 1973. I'm sorry, 72, not 70.
We're still evolving.
No
Yes.
question.
Yes,
No.
still definitely
And
evolving.
that's what most scholars of Judaism, certainly, but again, you could make the case in other religions. But that's that Judaism has always been evolving, and I mean, some and in both directions. You know, sometimes it's we go backwards.
Mhm.
You know, the majority of community going in one way as opposed to another. When certainly going back to those days in 1959, 1960, 61, when I went to Orthodox camp, if somebody would have said that there would be women rabbis, you know, within 15 years of that, I said, what are you talking about? How could there be women rabbis? But on the other hand, how could there be same-sex marriages? How could there be transsexual people? You know, there's so many different things that the world changes, and I think I've said this on a number of occasions, and I certainly said it in a number of opportunities of teaching, that it's you folks, it's the people, it's Amcha, not the rabbis, that make the change.
Mhm.
It's the people that say, this is what we need. We need our religious faith. We need our religious teaching to help guide us through this experience that we're having, difficult experience or joyful experience. We want our religious tradition to resonate with that and allow us to feel more confident, more faithful, if you will, given what we're encountering. And so the rabbis and the scholars of the tradition have to look back into it and say, okay, well, this is why such and such a decision was made, you know, years ago. I mean, I'll throw a different one out, just so we don't leave it to the 20th or 21st century. So obviously, for the first several thousand years of Jewish history, they practiced polygamy. A man could have more than one wife and be proud of it. Okay, I mean, there are pages after pages after pages in the rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, and whatever, of, you know, this is how you must treat your wives, not your wife, but your wives, and you could have as many as you chose, as many of those wives who would voluntarily enter into the relationship, the consecrated relationship, as long as you fulfilled your duty to all of those wives. Okay, it was approximately 1,200 years ago, no, 1,100 years ago, that one rabbi, responding to probably a lot of women, but maybe some men also, who said, this doesn't work for us anymore. And so there was what's called a takana. There was a correction. Let's correct this tradition. Okay, obviously it was okay. God didn't mind if you know, men had more than one wife, but so we're not going to change what God said, but we can change the quote unquote the tradition and the practice, because it makes more sense to our present cultural society and our mores. So Rabbi Gershon said, okay, for the next 1,000 years, and then it was voted upon, as you would, but for the next 1,000 years, no, polygamy is not allowed. You can't have more than one wife. So we've always been evolving and responding and adapting, or if we use the word but with a small r, reforming or reconstructing, if you will. Yes, Marcia, please. You're muted there.
You had talked about, and maybe I didn't understand it, that there were rabbis in the Orthodox group now.
Yes,
I had understood that they were taught the same as rabbis, but they were made other things, not rabbis.
No, there are several. It's still only a handful, but there are several who are functioning with a title of rabbi.
Oh, because they gave them another title 1510 or so many years ago, but
Yeah.
now it is a rabbi. It was another title.
Right. I'm blanking on a couple of them, but one of them is Maharat, Maharat. That's one of them, but I forget what some of the others are. But there are also, like I said, a handful of Orthodox women now who are claiming the title of rabbi.
They are a rabbi in a complete group. It isn't that there's another rabbi they just help. It is their congregation.
I don't know. I don't know exactly where they might be serving. I don't know if they're serving in congregations or in, pastoral chaplaincy roles or just teaching. I don't know. I know that there are several who are doing a lot of writing, doing a lot of research, and teaching. But I don't know necessarily. Hi, Bobby. I don't know necessarily if they're working with congregations, and if they are, they're the.
I would very much doubt that any of them
Yes.
are head rabbis.
Oh, I don't think anyone is a head rabbi.
No.
You're right. You're right. But there may be some who are functioning in congregations along with, like as an assistant rabbi or as a co-rabbi. There's one case, and I don't remember their name, but there's one case of a married couple, husband and wife who were both trained and are both as a rabbi couple.
And they are both Orthodox rabbis together.
Yes, but you do have to acknowledge that there are many different, I guess the technical word is sects, sects, many different sects and understanding and levels of practice, whatever, within the Orthodox community, ranging from modern Orthodox. Look, there is one modern Orthodox rabbi in Tucson who I work with frequently on a number of projects. Who, I keep it. I say, would you be willing to come and teach? Teach something down at Beth Shalom in Green Valley? He said, "Oh, I'd love to," but he won't come to services.
Mhm.
All right, but he absolutely
I thought that a lot of doors have been opened, and maybe some of them are named but not in action.
In many cases, yes, he would be comfortable with my coming and teaching in his synagogue, but there are other Orthodox rabbis who says, well, what are you kidding? I can't let you come into the. You can come in and participate in and be part of the minyan. You're Jewish, but you're certainly not a rabbi.
I know that I was a part of a conservative, and when I went for 3 months when my dad died, and if for some reason there was only 10 and I was part of the 10, they would walk out when there were certain prayers that had to be said.
Mhm.
Right.
But they did teach me how to lay my tefillin properly, and I was invited that after a service, I could come and have a drink with them up there. That was okay.
But 20, 30 years ago, that would have been impossible.
No.
No.
20, 30 years ago, no woman, even the mother of a bar mitzvah or whatever was not allowed up on the beach.
No, I remember when we elected a woman president of the congregation, and everybody the biggest thing was, well, how is she going to address the congregation on the high holidays because she wasn't allowed up on the bema?
Right,
And that wasn't that long ago.
right.
I
When
remember.
so here's another one. Again, just affirming how Judaism and evolves based on the needs and the patterns of the larger society of Amcha. When I married Lynn, which is going on 29 years now, I was known as the guitar playing rabbi in Detroit. Okay, and Lynn's brother and sister-in-law were very active members of one of the large conservative synagogues. And literally, she said to me, my sister-in-law said, I haven't decided yet if when you pick up a guitar to play at Adam, that's our oldest, at Adam's bar mitzvah, I haven't decided if I'm going to walk out of the sanctuary when you pick up your guitar to play. Okay. Now that was he's born in 82. So that was 1995. Adam's now turning 40. He's turning 40. They were brought up conservative. Okay. And now if you go to the synagogue where they are still members, there not only is guitar, but there's also flute and piano and and other instruments on Shabbos on the bima in there, so in the last 20 years or whatever, what I say that was 1995. Okay, so not even 25 years. That's change that's gone through in the largest conservative congregation in Detroit.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This was
You're welcome.
enlightening, and I never wanted to be a rabbi at one point, but I couldn't, but it didn't work. Anyway, that was just a thought of a young child.
Okay.
Okay, because we belong to a conservative synagogue, and Stephen S. Weiss came to talk one night at a lecture. And my dad said, you have to come and hear this. So he took me, and I was less than 10 or maybe 10. So I've been exposed to a lot of things because he didn't have a son and my sister wasn't interested. So therefore, I got all of the knowledge that I could.
Great.
Grandfather and my father.
Well, if you change your mind, you still want to study to be a rabbi, there are lots of people who are doing it as second and third careers. So,
Okay. No. Thank you so much for tonight. I so appreciated having this opportunity.
Okay.
And I got to be someplace in 5 minutes, so I have to say goodbye and thank
I have
you.
to be somewhere in 10, but that's okay.
Okay.
Can you say that, Anand?
Fran, go ahead. Sure.
Many years ago, when we still lived in New Jersey, I attended quite a number of Sally's services at Monmouth.
Great.
And the thing, I don't remember what she said, but I remember when there was a bat mitzvah, how she would come up and put her hands on the side of the face and lean and say something very, very, very beautiful to the person, to the young person.
Well,
Lovely. It's one of the, and I will be reminded of it again on Sunday. I'm officiating at the wedding of a young man, the groom, who I was at his bris, and I was the rabbi when he became bar mitzvah, and whatever. And it's quite meaningful to participate in that with the kids when they're young, but also to see them continue on for the next generation.